Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Salon in Israel, a conversation between Ulrich Baer and Amir Eshel. We're delighted to host this Salon-centered event, and I just looked up our last Salon event, which was about 5 years ago. It was breath turn into Timestat, the conversation between Pierre Jory and Paul Auster, and I can't believe that this is already 5 years ago. We should have a Salon event at least once a year, but you know, now we will get back into a more appropriate rhythm to appreciate this really groundbreaking and extremely important German language author. Let me thank a few people and institutions, of course, foremost Ulrich Baer and Amir Eshel for being here tonight and for addressing you and thinking and speaking on this eminent subject. Also the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their support of our academically inclined programming. My colleagues here at Deutsches Haus, Sarah, Hotaka, and Tony, and our videographers, Isabel and Laya. And in case you haven't noticed, we are taping this event. If you prefer not to be taped, now is the time to leave. So if you're staying, we're assuming that you're okay about being taped. Let me mention one upcoming event that we are presenting next Monday with our DAAD visiting scholar, Susanne Rohr from the University Hamburg. She will talk about Katja Petrovskaya's Maybe Esther. So you might want to come to this event. I think it will be terrific. As you might recall, Katja Petrovskaya was recently a DAAD Poetics Chair here at the German department, and Susanne has done terrific work on Katja's work, and we'll be happy to share it with you. All right. Well, you might have read the news today and heard that our wonderful government has now decided to think that the settlements in the West Bank don't constitute a violation of international rights. So this is something that shows us how important that region and Israel is still for the international debate of what is right and what is wrong. And I'm sure we will address these questions as part of your looking into Celan's response to being in Israel and looking at what Israel meant to him back then and then what it means to us today, and looking back through his poetry of what it meant to him then. This is a very convoluted statement, but I hope it makes sense to you. It makes sense to me on some level that I haven't figured out yet. All right, let me wrap things up and provide you with a little biographical information. And this will be a very short biographical information because these guys are so accomplished that I don't want to bore you with their entire list of great accomplishments. So here we go. Ulrich Baer is university professor at NYU and has published extensively on the representation of personal and collective trauma in literature, film, photography, and public debate. His books include We Are But a Moment, Remnants of Song, The Experience of Modernity in Charles Baudelaire and Paul Celan, and as editor and translator, The Dark Interval, Rilke's Letters on Loss, Grief, and Transformation. His podcast, Think About It, is devoted to in-depth conversation on powerful ideas and great books, and I recommend it to you highly. It's really worthwhile listening to. His most recent book, What Snowflakes Get Right, Free Speech, Equality, and Truth in the University, was published by Oxford University Press right now. All right. Amir Eshel is Edward Clark Crosset Professor of Humanistic Studies and Professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature at Stanford University. His research focuses on contemporary literature and the arts as they touch on memory, history, politics, and ethics. He's the author of Zeit der Zäsur, jüdische Lyriker im Angesicht der Shoah, Das ungesagte Schreiben, israelische Prosa und das Problem der palästinensischen Flucht und Vertreibung, Futurity, Contemporary Literature and the Quest for the Past, and, most recently, Poetic Thinking Today, which just came out this month by Stanford University Press and will be published by Suhrkamp next year, right? Yes. Okay. Do you have a month?
The fall program. So
all right.
October, yeah.
All right. Very well. He's the recipient of fellowships from the Alexander von Humboldt and the Friedrich Ebert Foundations and received the award for distinguished teaching from the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. Before we welcome our distinguished speakers, please silence your cell phones so that we may not be disturbed by ringtones. After they have their conversation, we'll open it up to questions and comments by you. Please note that we are recording the event and thus kindly request that you speak into the mic later when you have questions so that we can record this for the world and everyone to listen to elsewhere. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Uli and Amir.
Thank you for coming tonight here to Deutsches Haus in New York City. Thank you, Amir, for coming and continuing a long conversation we've been having about the poet Paul Celan. As Juliana said, today, like every day, is inflected by politics and history and the questions of who belongs where and what spaces belong to whom. And I wanted to start us out. You have really been thinking a lot about the anniversary of Paul Celan's visit to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, to Israel in 1969, about 50 years ago in a few weeks now. And there's a lot of attention to this visit. Paul Celan lived until 1970, but this was a very important visit in his life. And we are actually in continuous conversation. We've talked about this before, and we speak German and English. And I wanted to start with a very brief quote from Paul Celan's Meridian speech, where he says that the poem becomes the poem of something to be perceived, not the poem of something that has been perceived. It becomes conversation. Often it is a desperate conversation. And I do not believe this is a desperate conversation, but it is a conversation inflected by the German-speaking Jewish poet who has become the kind of figure of Holocaust remembrance for the European tradition when he goes to Israel in 1969, and what he thinks he finds in that country, in that place, in these specific places, and that's what you've been thinking about. So welcome to a non-desperate conversation, but an urgent one. And I think this is what Paul Celan gives us, this possibility of continuing a conversation when, as all of his poetry testifies to, when language had failed, when language had not allowed for the continuation of connection and conversation. So welcome, first of all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Uli, for inviting me, for having me here. Thank you, Juliane, and thank you, Deutsches Haus, and thank you to the Publikum, to join us for this event. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight.
And maybe I can ask you to start us out and sort of give us a bit of context of Paul Celan's visit to Israel in 1969. And then we'll go back also for the audience. I know there's a range of people in the audience, some who, as much as one can possibly know about Paul Celan, there's always something you don't know. We are two people who've written about Paul Celan for a long time. There are a lot of things we don't know. But we'll go back and fill in some of the gaps and blanks of who this poet is, because he's become a figure, I think, of difficult hope for so many readers. Not just people in the German tradition, or not just people in the diasporic Jewish tradition, but people in America, people in France, people in Latin America, in Asia. So he's actually also become the figure of the possibility of translating the European tradition into something that outlasts possibly the idea of Europe. But how did you get interested in this visit that he did in 1969 to Israel?
Well, I got interested in the visit because of a body of work Celan wrote right after the visit. So Celan visits Israel between September 30th, 1969 and October 17th, so about 2.5 weeks. And then he goes back to Paris and he writes about 20 poems. And I find the poems themselves he writes after the visit to be among the most beautiful and impressive parts of his later work. So that was my point of departure, to try to understand the poems he's writing upon returning from that visit. On a more biographical note, Israel is the country I'm coming from. I grew up in Israel. I have my family still living in Israel. I feel connected to the place. And for me, Celan's trip as a German Jewish poet after the war meant, in a way, an opportunity to also understand, where I'm coming from and how can I relate to my place of origin, a place I left behind me in 1988. So writing and thinking about Celan's visit meant for me also thinking about my own journey.
And do you want to start us out by showing us some of the images where Celan, whose name was Ansel and whose name has been changed several times. We talked about names last night quite a lot, and family names and what they say about belonging. For a lot of people in the world, it's not Celan, it's Salon, because he was French. And it's actually quite important that the Germans say Celan with a hard C, and the French say Salon, and the Americans don't quite know where to place him. And that was his name that he gave himself to become a poet, right? And left behind something, but at the same time, we'll see this, and I think you would give us a bit of the journey that he took. He's reconnecting with people from his origin.
Yes, absolutely. So to begin, maybe, he's born as Paul Pesach Anchel. So his Hebrew name is Pesach, Passover, of course. And that's one name he leaves behind when he changes his name to Paul Celan. But maybe by way of introduction or by way of getting into the conversation or deeper into the conversation, we can watch a few images from the life of Celan, so we have a better, emotional, entry to the conversation.
And while you pull them up, we talked about this last night, how one of the people who's going to figure prominently, the woman who he reconnects with in Jerusalem, she said, Celan was a very funny person. He was very, very funny sometimes. He had a sense of humor, which is not something that you would know if you read a lot of Germanistic, which is very serious. And he signaled something else, but for the people he connected with, so when we said this is a conversation, there is a kind of exuberance of language in this minimalist poetry. I think that is what has always connected me to this poetry, that it's kind of stripping language to an essential or minimalist idiom, but an incredible exuberance of what language could do for us. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to show us some of the pictures, especially the early and young Celan, which is a kind of a surprising images that have surfaced recently.
Yeah, we'll get there. Perhaps starting with a sense of the place he's coming from, which is the city of Chernovitz, the capital city of the Bukovina. There's an image, obviously, before the World Wars. And we see here in front of us the synagogue of the city, a very prominent, imposing building of which very little is left today. It's a fraction of the building we see in front of us, and it serves today as a cinema. Another image of Chernovitz of that time. Up above is the Jewish Cultural Center in the city. And again, a different angle on the synagogue, and we can see just kind of the dimension of Jewish life and culture in the city before the catastrophe. We said that Paul Celan is born Paul Pesach Anchel in 1920, so in fact next year we'll be celebrating his centennial. His 100th birthday, but also 50 years since the day he committed suicide in April of 1970. There's an image of Paul Celan when he was 15 years old. We know that he was, at the same time, a very funny and social person, but also he had the tendency to become very serious. He's writing poetry from a very young age. His early poetry is actually written in Romanian, and only later on he writes in German. It's interesting and important to note about Celan's parents that there's a difference between the father and the mother. The father is a Zionist, Leo Anchel, a convinced Zionist, and he insists that his son will learn Hebrew and go to a Hebrew day school. This is something Celan himself didn't like at all as a young boy. He was much more drawn to the culture his mother represents. His mother, Fritzi Schrager, comes from an observant family, but was very much connected to German culture. It is through the mother that he reads Schiller and Goethe, and later on Kleist and Rilke. And there is this tension between the language and the culture of the father and the language and the culture of the mother. This is an image of Celan's childhood home. It's a bourgeois home in the city of Czernowitz. He lives there until his youth. And again, we have a sense of the lost European bourgeois culture, which went under or came to an end with the outbreak of the Second World War. The house we see in this image is the house from which Celan's parents were taken in 1942 when they were deported to the concentration camp Mikhailovka in the Ukraine. It's a very sad story, obviously, and we know, as far as we know, Celan tried to convince his parents to go into hiding the night before they were taken. They insisted that they want to stay in this apartment, the house of which we see here. Celan goes into hiding, and when he comes back the following day, they were gone. As I said before, they are taken to Mikhailovka. As far as we know, I mean, we're not sure about it, but as far as we know, the father dies of typhus and the mother is shot in the neck. And obviously the trauma of the death of the parents and the trauma of the Shoah is something that stayed with Celan ever since. This is an image from later years, obviously. After the war, Celan leaves Czernowitz behind, goes to Bucharest, where he's working for a Russian publishing house. He doesn't stay all too long in Bucharest because he wants to be a poet. His path leads him western into Europe. So from Bucharest, he will go to Vienna, where he will spend half a year. He will meet the poet Ingeborg Bachmann. It's a big love story in 1948 between the two of them. And it's through Ingeborg Bachmann that Celan for the first time encounters the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger perhaps will play a role later on when we'll talk about one of the poems Celan wrote around the Israel visit because of his notion of thinking, so Heidegger's notion of thinking.
And if you're thinking of Paul Celan, he goes to Bucharest after the war. He's lost his parents. He himself escaped really certain death. The Russians come back to Czernowitz. The Nazis are defeated and retreat. Czernowitz is a region that's then under Soviet occupation. He doesn't want to stay there. And when he arrives in Bucharest and works for an editor, he is really a refugee, a stateless person who has a few languages and can edit something and writes poetry. He's not exactly the kind of high-skilled worker that countries adopt as immigrants. And I think his story is a story that is playing out all over the world today, that is playing out in Europe. He is coming from a place that has been absolutely destroyed. There's no going back. And he's arriving. And there's a kind of the part of Celan as a poet who we revere and read today that is not at all certain at this point. He's writing a few poems. The first book of poems, he writes Der Sand aus den Urnen in Vienna with Ingeborg Bachmann. He meets a woman who's also trying to be a writer. That book is published, and then he wants it to be, it's so badly published, he wants it to be pulped. He actually doesn't like his first publication. But he's not successful. He's not even identifiable as a poet, as a profession at this moment. He's just struggling to get by, right? So after Vienna, he goes to Paris.
Yeah. Paris is his city from 1948 onward. This is where he's going to write his most important poetry. It's a love-hate relationship with Paris. He finds the city fascinating. He learns, obviously, French very quickly. He meets his wife, Gisèle Lestrange, a Catholic French woman. They marry in 1952. And it's a big love. Being in Paris, finding the woman of his love. She's an artist. They produce together art. She's producing etchings, and he's writing poetry. And they have a very intense relationship in the 1950s. That's the time in which Celan is writing some of his most important poems. This period in his life takes a shift in 1960 for a variety of reasons. The most important of which is that in 1960, the widow of a French poet, Yvan Goll, that's the name of the poet, his widow publishes in all newspapers in Germany letters accusing Celan to have plagiarized the poetry of her late husband, Yvan Goll. Celan is deeply hurt and deeply shocked by those accusations. And most scholars agree that this accusation that he plagiarized the poetry of Yvan Goll pushes him mentally, so to speak, over the edge. And what begins in 1960 is a series of mental crises Celan is going through, including longer periods in which he'll be hospitalized in mental institutions. Partly also unable to leave mental institutions because he's dangerous or perceived as dangerous.
He knew Claire Goll, who also had been Rilke's lover and was a very important figure actually in European literary establishment. And I think he perceives this accusation of plagiarism in two ways: that he's not an original poet, and he doesn't count as a poet in relationship to Yvan Goll, to Rilke, to these people. And secondly, also that he's making things up or he's not accurate. And in some ways, this goes to he's writing, when he was saying he's writing poetry in Paris, he's writing in German. There's not a lot of warmth toward German writing, except at a certain very elite establishment by Parisians, so they don't know what he's doing. He's writing German poems, but he lives in Paris. He's not exactly able to share that and say, this is what I'm writing. So he has no readership at home in Paris. The only readership he has is in Germany, and now in Germany he's being attacked as having stolen his images, and behind it this accusation that maybe he isn't telling the truth. And he perceives that he's a Jewish poet who's also, in a complicated way, bearing witness to the Holocaust. And now he's being debated in the press, is Paul Celan a fraud? Is Paul Celan really a poet? And he reads that in a much deeper way as, is he not really the historical witness that he himself didn't style himself to be, but that his poetry nonetheless tries to do?
Yeah. To put it somewhat more starkly, Uli, with your permission, he suspects behind this attack, behind the accusation, he suspects anti-Semitism. As of 1960, depending how you want to put it, Celan is convinced that anti-Semitism and Nazism is on the rise in West Germany. He's reading daily the newspapers, following the conversations in the newspapers in a very minute manner. And he perceives the attacks on him as an attack on a Jewish person, the attacks on his art as questioning, for anti-Semitic reasons, the quality of his art. And again, this is playing a very important and difficult role in his mental condition. Yeah. Maybe on this note, we can take a look at another image, actually two images. So what we see here to my left is an image of neo-Nazi swastika engravings, or how do you call it in English? Graffiti, exactly. That's in a synagogue in Cologne in the 1960s. So there were in the 1960s a variety of such incidents in West Germany. And we should also mention here that in the 1960s, there's a rise of political activity on the far right in German politics. And again, Celan is following these news very closely. What we have here with this image is a newspaper clipping Celan made from Die Zeit from July 30th, 1965. And the clipping describes the arrival of the first German ambassador to the State of Israel. This little piece was written by Marion Dönhoff, who was the editor of Die Zeit, the very important weekly intellectual publication. And she's writing with disgust, one could say, about what happens when Rolf Pauls, the ambassador, arrives in Israel. What happens, namely, is that thousands of people are demonstrating against the arrival of a German, representative to the state of Israel, because they see in it a selling out, a way of giving up Jewish memory and the memory of the Holocaust for material benefits. They're appalled. Marion Dönhoff reads about the way the ambassador is received in Israel, and then she writes this piece, and she concludes, maybe I'll read the German, and Uli, you can help me with translation. So she concludes her piece by saying, es ist traurig zu denken, dass die alttestamentarische Drohung bis ins dritte und vierte Glied in dem Land praktiziert wird, in dem die Bergpredigt gehalten und das Hohelied Salomons geschrieben wurde, im Heiligen Lande.
So she is saying, so there were 2,000 young people in Israel demonstrating against the arrival of the German ambassador, which signaled for them reconciliation, forgiveness, and we're now done with this past. Where there's Israel, they're not ready. They're young people. They're not survivors. They're young people. And she's saying there are a few crazy people in Germany, a few who do these things or things. There are a few anti-Semites. But really, Germany's not that kind of country anymore. And then she says it's very sad to think that the biblical thread from the Old Testament that into the third or fourth generation, not to forgive, basically, is being practiced in the country in which the Sermon on the Temple Mount was given, and the Song of Solomon was written. That in the Holy Land, there's no room for forgiveness. So she's sort of saying Israel should be the place where this is possible. So how can these Israelis resist this? And then he writes in the margin, she says there are a few crazy people who put these swastikas up, and Celan says, what about all the Nazis in the government, in the current German government, 1961, 60. So he's actually saying this is downplaying the presence of Nazis, actually, not of a few anti-Semites, of actual Nazis in the government, and it's putting the burden on Israel to actually accept this gesture that the Germans want to now be forgiven, in a way. And what's interesting that he took this enormous interest in politics in a way, because we do think of him as a bit as a poet who's writing this very difficult poetry. He was completely absorbed in daily news, right? This was urgent to him.
Yeah.
And this is long before he goes to Israel. So this is 65, so 4 years before.
Yeah, and there are many signs, we know it because of the archive. The Celan archive in Marbach, Germany is very well kept. We know that there are many more clippings like this one of political occurrences. He collects these clippings, and partly they find also their way into his poetry. So sometimes if you read his poetry and it strikes you as incredibly difficult and dark, maybe it's perhaps because some of the poetry refers to historical events he's following, and echoes of them are in those poems. What's important to note already now, this is 1965, so it's 4 years before he travels to Israel. What's important to notice is that it's not because he is incredibly pro-Israel, not as a Zionist, he is shocked and disgusted by this. It's because what he perceives to be as not understanding a Jewish sensibility, as something he perceives as kind of quiet anti-Semitism. Because, Dönhoff's remarks at the end, quote unquote, accuse Jews for not practicing Christian forgiveness. In Christianity, forgiveness is something very important. It's one of the centers of the creed. In Judaism, not so much so. Yeah. And
we can have a whole nother seminar. So Yankelevich wrote a book and actually gave a talk in Jerusalem on forgiveness in the Jewish tradition. Levinas has written about this. Jacques Derrida, who taught in this room for many, many years, reflected a lot on this demand and on forgiveness for the unforgivable, and whether to maintain that something remains unforgivable. And I think this is what's at stake here, whether Celan thinks by forgiving you efface the fact that something remains unforgivable even when political relations can be reestablished, even when a conversation can continue, There are things that remain unforgivable. And this is what poetry can maybe maintain more than politics, that there's something which we would consider a contradiction. Something is unforgivable and must not be forgotten, and yet we move on. Whereas politics moves on. It has to do certain things. It's maybe not a commemorative practice in the same way. Although this is 65, this is after the big trials, the Eichmann trial, the Frankfurt trials, the first trials, which was after France is trying to think whether to remove the statute of limitations. And the second thing is France had a rule that no French citizens could ever be accused of war crimes committed in the name of Nazi Germany until the late 60s. So the Barbie trial. So France actually says, for example, no one in France committed any of such crimes, of these crimes, as a legal statute. So Celan is trying to step out of the space where politics or the law have to make certain rules. And he says, how do you remember an unforgivable crime? This is not the way to do it, in his view, right?
To put it mildly. So 1965, and another image I would like to share with you is this one here. Those of you who read Hebrew can easily recognize two words that appear here spread all over the page, namely Yad Vashem. So this is a drawing, or how shall I, a work of art created by Celan on a piece of paper. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact date in which he creates this artwork, but it's filled with this pair of Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem, which is the central museum, a memorial site in Jerusalem, and Celan is thinking about the meaning of these words very closely, at least during the 60s.
You have to translate for us, Yad Vashem.
Yad Vashem. Yad is hand and Shem is name, so hand and name. That's the meaning of these two words. And these two words will play an important role in a poem Celan will write in 1967, and that's the poem I think we'd like to focus on today. So maybe first we'll take a look at the poem and then say some things around the poem. The poem is called in German Denk dir. We have here the German original, and then on the other side John Felstiner's translation. Maybe a word to the poem before. Celan is writing this poem on June 6th and 7th of 1967. So he starts writing it the day in which the 6 Days War breaks out. Around noontime of that day, Celan goes to a demonstration in Place de la Concorde together with French students and French faculty from the Sorbonne. And they demonstrate under the banner, Damit Israel lebt, so Israel will live. This is something that's difficult for us to understand from the perspective of 2019. Israel is a strong, perhaps too strong state, quite dominant in the Middle East, if not also on the world stage. But in the weeks and months before the 6 Days War, there was a sense in Europe and elsewhere that the state of Israel is endangered, that it is imminent, that the Arab countries surrounding Israel will attack it. I won't get into this feeling at the moment, but I would like to say that Celan, living in Europe in 1967, very much shares this fear. And we know from letters he's writing, we know from his notes, that in those weeks and months before the war, he's deeply, deeply worried that Israel will vanish from the face of the earth. Now again, it's important to note, it's not because he is a convinced Zionist. It's not because he is a nationalist that for him it's important that Israel as a state will survive. I think what drives him in this fear, or what motivates this fear, is the knowledge that in Israel, millions of Jews are living. Many of them just survived the Holocaust a short while ago. And the idea that they will be wiped out, as it were, from the face of the earth is something that troubles him deeply. Now, if you follow the rhetoric of someone like Gamal El Nasser before the war, the president of Egypt, there was a lot of talking about throwing the Jews into the Mediterranean. So Celan's fears are also fed by the language he reads in the newspaper. And again, we don't have the time now to go into depth into this, but I can reassure you that in the archive there are clippings like those we've seen before, in which Celan is following those news from the Middle East daily.
Let's look at this poem. What we're trying to do is not to give you a biographical account, but to let us think with Celan, whose poetry says they are layers of places and times that are simultaneous, maybe contradictory, mutually exclusive. That 1967, 1969 Jerusalem, and then 2019 Israel, what you just said. It is a very different place and time, and Celan's poetry wants to put these things next to each other without maybe resolving, it used to be this, it's that now. So let's look at this poem, see what it is. It's doing quite a few things.
Yeah, that's true. Shall we start with the German? Yeah. With the recording? So what I have for you is the recording of Paul Celan in the reading he gave in Jerusalem on October 8, 1969. And in this reading in Jerusalem, the very last poem he reads is this poem we have in front of us. Now, when we listen to Celan, pay attention to the intensity of the voice. People who were at the reading said that there was something almost obsessed, if not aggressive, that's the term they use, when they listened to him reading this poem.
The other thing I always say before you listen, so take a breath and relax. And for Paul Celan, poetry was a turn of breath. And you should actually just listen and hear his voice. And then we'll talk about what it is and all that. And there's a way in which poems, they do their work without you knowing what it means. So those of you in the room who don't have perfect German right now, you may after this poem, but just relax into it.
Okay, now let's see if the technique will work with us. So something is not working here. Let's try this slide over here. Okay, this should work now.
Denk dir, der Moorsoldat von Masada bringt sich Heimat bei, aufs Unauslöschlichste, wider allen Dorn im Draht. Denk dir, die Augenlosen ohne Gestalt führen dich frei durchs Gewühl, du erstarkst und erstarkst. Denk dir, deine eigene Hand hat dies wieder ins Leben emporgelittene Stück bewohnbarer Erde gehalten. Denk dir, das kam auf mich zu, namenwach, handwach, für immer vom Unbestattbaren her.
Okay, so maybe I'll read in English. Although I have to say the German, I grew up speaking German and listening to it. It's my, native language, as they say. It's not very native in a way. It's your mother tongue and all these words that Celan really interrogates in this poem. He does something to German that is not German in the way you speak it. It is actually very German, and it does something which all poetry does. It takes the ordinary language that we use every day and makes it strange for us. So it's as if you're hearing it for the first time. So even the people in the room who have native German, it is a different German. And I think part of what he's trying to do is to give us a new language. So in English, this is this Feldsteiner's turn? So John Feldsteiner, who was a friend and a colleague who wrote a book, a very long literary biography of Paul Celan, he translated this. It's been translated many, many times. Just think, the peat bog soldier of Masada makes a homeland for himself, most ineffaceably against every barb in the wire. Just think, the eyeless ones without shape lead you free through the tumult. You go from strength to strength. Just think, your own hand has held this piece of habitable earth, again suffered up into life. Just think, this came toward me, name awake, hand awake, forever, from the unburyable. So the poem, this poem sort of lives in you once you read it a few times, and it's first of all an imperative, just think, which has been translated variously, just think, or think of this. It's kind of an imperative to think. And what do you think what is this gesture supposed to do, to create in the beginning? Because poetry is doing something rather than saying something. He's not describing something, obviously, he's telling us what to do, right?
So it's a very important and difficult question, Uli, so I'll try as much as possible to share with you how I read it after having read it, countless times and having thought about it a lot. I think what's really crucial here are the 4 times in which the poem insists on this human activity of thinking, and how the poem lives this activity open. The poem doesn't dictate us what to think and how to think. In a way, it addresses us, urges us to just think. I think this is something the translation captures very well. It's in the imperative, and the perspective is into the future. It's not that the poem looks back in time, it describes something that happens. The poem urges us to think in the future about what the poem exposes or bring in front of us. Thinking, I would suggest to see both in the tradition, we mentioned before that Celan reads Martin Heidegger, so definitely in the tradition Martin Heidegger stands for, in which thinking is a unique human activity, open-ended, boundless, something we should be engaged in every day as much as possible the entire time.
In the way, maybe opposed to kind of a goal-oriented thinking, problem-solving, instrumental reasoning. So this is a type of thinking that is taking place for its own sake, an activity that's deeply human, and that actually for this philosophical tradition is the thing that makes us human, that we can think for ourselves and not just to solve a problem or an issue, which is what which also other animals can do quite well. But we presume we don't really know. But that we actually think, and part of it is to think about ourselves. The other thing you just said, it takes place in the present, and in Germany you can use the present tense to indicate the future. That's why Germans who live in New York always say, I see you tomorrow, and you mean to say, I'll see you tomorrow? But when they say that, I visit you on Sunday, you're thinking, no, you will visit me on Sunday. But they drop that will, because in German you can use the present to indicate the future. So this poem is sort of, in a strange way, in this kind of present, but also opens up the future. And if we can maybe go to the first stanza even, which is really charged and loaded, and I think what this poem is doing, and this is what we're trying to get to, this is a poem which resonates and is written during the Six-Day War with Israel, but is it opening up the possibility of thinking what Israel is, or is it just saying this is what Israel is right now? So there's the military activity, the event of the war, that will assert something. But I think the poem is maybe doing something else, to say, think about what is happening. And we're sitting here today in 2019 thinking about even what is happening, not what happened, but what will happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. A lot of it is about resistance. So the image of the Moorsoldat for Masada, the Peabog soldier of Masada. This goes back to the 1930s. This hymn was written by inmates of a concentration camp. They were communists, they were socialists, not Jews, and they wrote this hymn, the hymn of the Moorsoldaten. And this hymn became very important for freedom fighters all over Europe in the 1930s. This was the song that was sung in Spain during the Civil War in Spain. So Celan, in an interesting manner, brings together this tradition, which is a tradition of political progressiveness of the left, together with the memory of Masada. And I think the core of it is to urge us to think about the importance of resistance.
So give us a one-sentence history of Masada, which you can visit today when you go to Israel, but actually it's a really resonant symbolic site. But what does Masada stand for?
So Masada stands for the last center of Jewish resistance against Rome, when the Roman Empire crushes the Jewish polity in what is today Israel and Palestine. So at the end of this rebellion, a group of families, soldiers, is holding on to this fortress in Masada on the mountain. The Romans are surrounding them. And according to tradition, to legend, to history, we're not quite sure. What happens in the end is when they realize that the Romans are coming, they commit collectively suicide. So the myth of Masada is the myth of resistance to the bitter end, even at the cost of your own life.
So it's a site of resistance through suicide. So it's already a really complicated, contradictory place. And then he says, so he puts this Pete Box soldier, the Moorsoldat. So this is a chain gang song from prison inmates who are oppressed by the fascist regimes of Europe. This song was a song I grew up with in my childhood. I have no idea why. It's a song that children sang in Germany. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten, wir ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor, ins Moor. It was sort of, I think, to the progressive German left, this is what you taught your children to sing in the 70s. I didn't grow up in the 40s. So it's an odd thing it survived. So he's putting this resistance of people who've been oppressed by fascism next to Masada, of the Jews who were able to escape their fate under the Romans through suicide, which is a different type of resistance. And those are yoking together two events, which is the fascist oppression of European Jews and of communists in Europe and socialists, and this other tradition of the Romans suppressing the first manifestation of the Jewish settlements in this region. So he's yoking together two really totally different separate historical events separated by a few thousand years, completely different ideologies. So it's in this one sentence here. And so our more soldiers, now this Pete Buck soldier, he teaches himself home. What is it? He makes a homeland for himself. But in German, it's really, he's teaching himself. He instructs himself not what it means to be, he teaches himself home. The idea of home, or he gives himself a home, right? That's what so this is what you could read it as the first sentence. Is this the question of Israel establishing itself in this region of the world, do you think?
Well, I think that's partly how I would read it. So a claim that there should be a Jewish home somewhere on the face of this earth.
Yeah.
And that what just happened in the 6 Days War, again, he's writing this poem in the first days of the war, is that this moment of aggression was an expression of securing a home for Jews who are living in Israel. But not in the name of absolute military might, not in the name of a nationalist agenda, but really in the narrower sense of making sure that the people who live there can call this place a home. Again, let me bring some biographical material from around the time the poem is written. So Celan, obviously, when the war turns out to be a success for the state of Israel, Celan is relieved, and he writes friends and family and expresses his relief by what just happened during the war. But he's also worried about what's going to happen now in the Middle East. And he writes in one of the letters that the way he reads the situation at the moment, in the Middle East, is that the big powers are playing their game, and the people living in the region are those who suffer and will continue to suffer. So I find it quite incredible to read, these sentences from today's perspective, because I think there's something in his writing, in the letters, that senses that although Israel won the war, the conflict is not over, and perhaps in some ways it will take a turn to the worse later on.
And then to just remark on this, what he does with the German, not to the German, but he says in one of his speeches, he says, German passed through all these thousand-fold darknesses of death-bringing speech, and it emerged enriched by this experience. Meaning that the German before the war, which is the German of Rilke and the German of Brecht before the war, and the German of culture, Schiller, Goethe, etc., the German passes through the war and the Holocaust, and it is used to implement the destruction of the European Jews. This word unauslöschlichste, which is ineffaceably. Auslöschen was a word that the Germans used as a euphemism to expunge the Jewish populations in the eastern countries. So it was a word used to euphemize the genocide. So Celan knew this. So he's using a word that in the German bureaucracy was used to say, we're just going to cleanse, like ethnic cleansing, which is a euphemism. Ethnic cleansing has nothing to do with cleanliness. It is the murder of people. So he's using a euphemism to say, to put, I think, the memory of this event into our mind through the language which has been corrupted, and he calls it enriched, which people have talked about a lot because the German state under Nazis was called the Third Reich. In German, the word for rich and empire is the same, Reich. So he says it was enriched, like it was infused with Nazism in a way. So he's using this language and he's trying to turn it against himself, maybe without doing what this article from Die Zeit did earlier to say, oh no, we have reached a place we can forgive and forget and move on. He says it is still inhabiting our language. It is still in us here. And so he does this throughout this, and what I said earlier, we couldn't go through all of this here. It's German that is, and I want to stress this, it is not going against traditional German. It is actually, revealing what capacity there's left for language to say something new. It's not saying language has failed and been corrupted and now I'm going to twist it against itself. And Celan, this is the plagiarism concern. He was really concerned when people said, you're making this word up, this doesn't exist. And he always said, all Celan scholars quote this, every word he uses is in the dictionary. Many of them were probably in really specialized geological dictionaries or zoological and anatomical biology. He uses all these technical vocabularies to give him a space to say something that couldn't be said. Maybe if you go to the rest, I mean, it's a poem that makes you think, and you're saying he may anticipate, or he may say at least keep open the possibility that even this victory will not be so great for everybody, right? This victory isn't the end of this story. This is someone who knew there was no end to these kind of displacements.
Absolutely. So I think he gives us this poem and urges us to think with this poem about realities that are our own realities today.
So I'm going to ask you what this own reality is. If we can move forward a little bit to the pictures of today.
Yes.
And where Celan went in Israel. And actually what we want to think about with this poem. So we could do a couple more hours on this poem. We really apologize to everybody and the poets that we're not doing it. But go to those pictures. Where did Celan go in 1969? What did he see? And what do we see today when we're there? This is what I think we think this poem is asking us to do. Think about what you see today in Israel through the inflection of Celan, who visited this place 50 years ago.
Just think.
Yeah.
Just think.
Okay.
So the poem is written in 1967, and what I want us now to take a look at is this image right over here. Celan arrives in Israel in September 30th, 1969. We have an image of the airport he's landing in. It's not an anecdote, but I think if you think carefully about Celan and you know the way he thinks about time, Celan used to think about places like this airport as containing in memory all the temporal layers that belong to them. So this is a modern airport of the 1960s. It was built on the site of a Templar colony called Wilhelma. And in Wilhelma, during the First World War, there was a German soldier, a wounded German soldier, who was recovering from his wounds in Wilhelma. His name was Rudolf Höss, who later became the commandant of Auschwitz. So when Celan is landing in this airport, the memory of this moment, of this place, is also contained in the experience. We see him here with his friend, David Zeidman, who taught French literature at Tel Aviv University. David Zeidman is his host. Celan will live in his apartment near Tel Aviv in the first few days when he is in the country. And then from Tel Aviv, he goes up to Jerusalem, where he will give the reading. We heard before one poem he recites during this reading. And later on, I'll show you some more images from there. Maybe another image that's kind of interesting. So the day Celan arrives in Israel, that's September 30th, 1969. What are the newspapers are writing? They're writing about Golda Meir in New York. Golda Meir got from the mayor of New York the keys to the city. So in the spirit of the euphoria following the 6 Days War, Golda Meir is regarded as, Israel's leader. Yet at the same time, we see an image of Willy Brandt after the elections of 1969, the elections that will make him for the first time a German chancellor, and in a way introduce a whole new era of German politics.
And he's known to my generation of Germans as the chancellor who went down on his knees at the Warsaw Memorial for the crimes that the Germans committed against Poland, which is in every country a really big gesture. You know that in this country we're not exactly in the mode of apologies right now. But this is what he hasn't done yet, but he will be known for that. Okay,
so September 30th, 1969. Celan will also travel to Safed in northern Israel. That's a very important city in the history of the Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. Celan is reading the work of Gershom Scholem. He's very interested in the Kabbalah. And one of his stations in Israel is in the city of Sfat. The image, unfortunately, is not very clear. I see it as a kind of a stunning image of Celan. He's not doing very well, by the way. During some of the days, he's in Israel. And then with the Star of David in the background, I find it a very evocative image to think of. In Jerusalem, during the reading, we heard before the poem he recited. So in the big room in Beit Agron, that's the building he was holding the reading in, Gershom Scholem, who we see here, is also among of the audience, or in the audience. The poet Leah Goldberg, the poet Yehuda Amichai, and the poet Manfred Winkler are also participating.
Tell us who they are. So Winkler is born in Würzburg, but is a Hebrew poet, probably the great Hebrew poet of Israel, Amichai, right? Scholem is the great scholar of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, and who keeps on publishing a book, it seems, every few months in Germany during this period, but is at Hebrew University and in Jerusalem, so he's very much strongly self-identified as he made that choice to live in Israel. And if you so this is kind of the literary establishment, but with deep connections, very complicated connections to the German-speaking world.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. I mean, for all of them, German, one could say, was the Kultursprache, the language of culture. They carried with them, all of them.
He published in Amichai, it's all in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Scholem writes in German.
Yes. Leah Goldberg translates from German into Hebrew, but also from French and from Italian and from Russian. She's a real comparative literature scholar, and also a wonderful, wonderful poet. So these are all, and if you think about the lives of these people, are all touched, obviously, by Jewish history of the 20th century. Scholem was able to migrate to Palestine early on in his life, but Yehuda Amichai had to flee, his family had to flee Würzburg. Leah Goldberg, who studied Semitic languages at the University of Bonn, couldn't quite complete her studies because of the rise of Nazis to power. Later on, Celan will also read in Tel Aviv twice. Once he will speak in front of the Hebrew Writers Association, and then the following evening there is a reading in Tel Aviv. Maybe we'll get to that reading later on, because it was for him a very difficult event, an event that led to Celan shortening his trip to Israel by 3 days. He was supposed to leave Israel on October 20th, but because of the second reading in Tel Aviv, he decides to leave the country early on. But I want us first to move forward and to remember his days in Jerusalem. I mentioned before the 20 poems Celan wrote upon returning from Israel to France, and I said that those are some of the most beautiful poems and most important poems he's writing toward the end of his life. The fact that those poems are so incredible have to do also with the woman we see here, Ilana Shmuly, who was born like Paul Celan in Chernovitz in 1924. She's slightly younger than him. They lost touch in the course of the war and after the war, but then they meet again in Paris in 1965. And they spend a long evening together into the morning hours. They walk the streets of Paris, and it's a lovely encounter. Then again, they lose touch with each other. Until Celan arrives in Israel in September of 1969, he writes her a letter and tells her, "Dear Ilana, I am in the country and I'll be in Jerusalem. Would it be possible for us to get together?" And they get together when Celan arrives in Jerusalem, and they spend 2 days walking through Jerusalem. She's his guide to Jerusalem. She takes him everywhere. In a moment, I'll show you some of these places. And out of these walks with Ilana Shmuly through Jerusalem, those 20 poems largely emerge. So the poems bury with them the trace of their walks through Jerusalem during October 8th and 9th of 1969. And I'm mentioning all of this also to say the obvious, and that is that they fall in love. And this is the last...
There's nothing obvious about falling in love. But it's so important because there's two things that Salon has been interpreted as finding something in Israel, and he does find love with somebody who he actually knew during the war. In the early 40s, they were friends, and then he meets her once before. And when he meets in Paris, they don't have this relationship, but they have this incredible affair. He's deeply inspired, and the poems are very erotic, which is always really fun to, when critics write about them, they always have to say, this is nearly, what they use the word obscene or pornographic. They're totally frank. So they have sex, and he writes about it. It's a great German tradition. From Goethe to Rilke, they have very erotic poetry. You wouldn't know it if you don't know German poetry. But these are very charged poems, and they are fusing this experience of walking through Jerusalem with falling in love, right? I mean, she becomes Jerusalem for him kind of as a live experience, right?
Yeah, yeah. Jerusalem in a spiritual manner, Jerusalem that's not just Jerusalem of stones and material, it's a spiritual Jerusalem.
And as you said, he's not doing well at this point. He's separated from his wife. It's very difficult, and he is in his late 40s, and this is a real moment when he's very alive, right? And
Yes.
And they have this incredible correspondence also, which has been published recently. But these poems are really in some ways, when I said very early on, poetry is a desperate conversation. I think these poems are a desperate conversation. The letters are, Ilana Shmuly said about her own letters, I keep on saying the same thing. I don't really say anything. She just kept on saying how great these few days were. And she almost apologized for not having more content in them. And people, you read them today, they're very moving.
They are very moving. They are very moving, and what happens is that she sends him letters from Israel to Paris after he returns to Paris, and he returns with his own letters, and almost all the letters are accompanied with the poems he's writing those very days. So the 20 poems I mentioned before are poems he's writing, and as he's writing them, he's sending them together with the letters back to her, to Israel. And we have here an example of a letter. Letters they exchanged from 1969. Again, unfortunately, the image is not that clear. And here in this image, we see two of the poems he sends to her during the same time. Now, what I'd like now to do is to take us back to those 2 days in Jerusalem, October 8th and 9th of 1969. Very hot days. It's a hot fall, just like the fall that is now in Israel, very almost unbearably hot. And she takes him through the city. The city, after the 6 Days War, is walkable on both sides. So the side that was West Jerusalem and was in Israel's possession before the 6 Days War, but also East Jerusalem that was conquered during the war, and now you could visit and see those places. And she takes him through those places, working on the anniversary of Celan's visit to Israel. I wanted to go myself back to the same places they visited and to have my own sense of those places today. And going back to the poem we read before, Denk dir, just think, I wanted to think with Celan about those places. So let me share with you some of the impressions and some of the thoughts I had while visiting those places now during the summer of this year. So Shmuly and Celan start their journey through the city on Mount Scopus. Mount Scopus, this is historically when Jewish pilgrims used to come to Jerusalem from the north, they would first ascend Mount Scopus, and from Mount Scopus they could look at the city. So Mount Scopus is called Scopus because this is where you would see the city in front of you in antiquity. And this is what Celan and Shmuly see in 1969. We see here the walls of the city, and in the middle, of course, the Omar mosque in the middle. Now, they stand on the ridge of Mount Scopus, and they look to the southwest. Now, when you look at the other side of the same ridge on Mount Scopus, this is what you see. Again, the images are not that clear, but I can share with you that this is the town of Issa. That's a Palestinian town toward the north of Jerusalem. You can see it again from Mount Scopus. And when you look a little bit closer today, just as Celan and Shmuly looked in 1969, you see something that they didn't see in 1969. Namely, you see the separation wall separating what is now a part of Israeli governed Jerusalem and the Palestinian territory. So, in other words, to just think with Celan in 2019 means also to just think this reality, which was then obviously not the case, but today it is here, and the people who live on that side of the wall cannot just cross over to the other side. Yeah. So another image, again from Mount Scopus, is the image of the amphitheater. So Shmuly and Celan go to the amphitheater. In this amphitheater, the Hebrew University was created in 1924. The big ceremony with Chaim Weizmann was there, speeches were held, and the amphitheater is looking toward the Dead Sea. So you're looking in direction of the east. When Shmuly and Celan are there in 1969, there is nothing to the east. The east is just a desert. Again, the image is not that great. I have to apologize, but I can tell you that when you look exactly in the same direction today, the big settlement of Ma'ale Adumim is right in front of you. A settlement that obviously was not there, and in the course of the settlement politics was created, and tens of thousands of Jewish citizens of Israel are living there, and this is a part of the political reality we mentioned at the beginning of the evening. Shmuly and Celan continue on the ridge, so they walk the ridge from Mount Scopus to the Mount of Olives, and this is what they see from the Mount Olive viewpoint. We see here again the old city and the wall, and we see also the gigantic Jewish cemetery which is spread all over Mount Olives. And in the poetry Celan will write upon returning to Paris, in those 20 poems I mentioned before, there are traces, there are words he's using invoking those places, including the view they have from Mount Olive to the old city. Most importantly is the gate you see here. So Jerusalem has 7 gates all over the walls surrounding the city, and the gate you see over there is called the Gate of Mercy. And the Gate of Mercy was built in the 7th century. According to tradition, this is the gate through which the Messiah will enter the city of Jerusalem when we will all be saved. And the Gate of Mercy is blocked. You cannot enter to the Gate of Mercy. And there's a whole wonderful tradition around the question why the gate is blocked, namely to prevent the Messiah from coming. And again, this is something Celan takes on in poems he writes in order to reflect on his experiences during that tour through the city. This is an image of the cemetery from a little bit closer. It's really very starking to see this city of the dead in the middle of the city. Now, they arrive in the tomb of Absalom. Absalom was the son of David, the rebellious son of David. And Shmuly mentions, when she describes her trip with Celan through the city, that they wanted for sure to spend some time in this tomb of Absalom. And the reason for that was, according to her description of the day, is because both of them loved Absalom's rebelliousness. She said, we wanted to be there because Absalom was rebellious. We didn't want to go to Gat Shemane. We didn't go to the churches and to the digging sites all over Jerusalem. We wanted to pay homage to the rebellious son. So if you think about the song of the Moor soldier, this is another echo to it. And when I was there was a Palestinian school children, a day of fun in Jerusalem, and they were sitting there and having a break in the shade. And I couldn't but think about the stark difference between this image and what Celan and Shmuly might have seen when they were there in 1969. So this is the Gate of Mercy I mentioned before, the blocked Gate of Mercy. One of the sad facts about the political situation in Jerusalem today is that since the Gate of Mercy is close to the Muslim section of the old city, everything around the Gate of Mercy is very much neglected and unfortunately filled with trash and dirt. For reasons that are beyond me, the city of Jerusalem doesn't take care of that section of the city. And again, that's something when I was there that kept me thinking with Salon, why this is the case. Here is another image, and you can see that there are empty coffins just thrown around and some burnt bushes, etc. This is a Muslim graveyard right under the Gate of Mercy. Now, they take a break when they walk Jerusalem. They take a break in the American Colony Hotel. This is a Palestinian hotel in East Jerusalem, and of all the places they could go to, it's interesting that she takes him to the American Colony Hotel for a break. And when I was there, as a way to kind of walk on their path, I had to think about this shopkeeper who was a part of the hotel staff. I was with a friend, we were talking Hebrew with each other, and it was clear that he didn't like it at all, the Palestinian who was standing there. I must admit that just being there as an Israeli, speaking Hebrew, in what is still today a Palestinian hotel, I felt myself, very uncomfortable, because many of the people who live in East Jerusalem live there with hardly any political rights to speak of. So another thing that one must think about if we go back to the figure of thinking with Salon. Now, they continue their trip through Jerusalem. On the way to Bethlehem, they wanted to visit the tomb of Rachel, the historical tomb of Rachel, and they wanted to go to the Nativity Church in the city of Bethlehem. On their way there, they pass in a monastery, Mar Elias, a very famous Jerusalem monastery, and then they look from the monastery in the direction of southeast. Now, when they're there in 1969, there is nothing, just beautiful trees and open, naked landscape. That's 1969. When I was there in the summer, and again, the year is 2019, what you see here, the buildings in the backdrop, are all buildings belonging to Har Choma. That's another huge settlement that was built already after the Oslo Accords were signed. And the building of Har Choma was among the reasons why the negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians exploded the way they did in the Second Intifada. So again, you know, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think
I'm gonna ask you to conclude, which is hard to do. In some ways, we've now arrived in 2019, and you're seeing things that you're saying, if I hear you correctly, they couldn't have seen. At the same time, they were also not seeing things that were there. The presence of Palestinians, of course, in Jerusalem, that's not something they really sort of looked at. But in some ways, you're seeing is informed by this reading to see things that are habitually overlooked or written out of certain accounts, right? So what you're trying to do, I think, is to read Celan and say, he opens up a space to see these layers, as you described earlier, of history or of people in certain places. And none of them probably are totally compatible because they're the same people in the same places. And as you said, the city of Jerusalem deliberately neglects certain spaces, lets them overgrow and be filled with trash, and other ones they totally kept out of, and the other ones they completely keep up. So my question to you is sort of this pilgrimage of going back on the footsteps of Celan and Lana Shmuly, and he said he left early, and then Celan, this is the terrible part actually, he commits suicide within not quite a year half a year of this trip. So in some ways there was a moment of hope and a moment of finding something, but it's not actually readable as, oh, he loved Israel and it redeemed him. Not at all. It had been read for a while, but I think now we have a much deeper sense of what he was trying to say is this is an attempt to find what he calls in some other poem like heartland or something, but he couldn't really find it. So when you go back today, what do you see there?
I see the complexities. I see the complexities. I see the simultaneity of elements of reality one cannot and perhaps should not try to kind of iron away or iron out. I think often when we think about Israel and the reality of Israel and Palestine, we very quickly jump to very clear judgments. We have very clear views. We know exactly what's right, what's wrong, who's right, who's wrong. We have very quickly an opinion, and often, you know, including myself, we utter that opinion to whoever wants to listen. I think with Celan, or trying to see the reality through Celan's eyes, you slow down. You try to absorb the complexities. You try to absorb the simultaneity of various time layers, temporal layers, you know, in that space. And to carefully reflect on that reality, not just to jump immediately to opinion, to conclusion, to a very clear statement one could utter. Partly, you see the realities we see here, and partly those realities are appalling and deserve a lot of political criticism. But who knows who lives in the settlement of Har Homa? Not only convinced settlers live in Har Homa. Or to give you another example of those complexities, I mentioned before Mount Scopus. That's the point of departure for the tour they take to the city. The Hebrew University is located on Mount Scopus. So the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the center, especially humanities and social sciences, is on Mount Scopus. Now, one could say, as a lot of people do in this country and elsewhere, that one should boycott the Hebrew University because the Hebrew University is a part of the Israeli state, and the Israeli state occupies the territories and oppresses Palestinians. I leave that question, you know, aside for a moment, but let me share with you the fact that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian students who study in the Hebrew University today. So Palestinians from East Jerusalem, those who live on the Israeli side of the wall, can register at the Hebrew University and visit it as students like all other students. And when you walk, as I did this summer, to take those photographs, you see scores and scores of Palestinian students walking the campus, visiting, you know, taking classes like all other students. So this is also a part of the complexity, and I think often if we don't do what Celan urges us to do, which is to think, just think, if we immediately jump to a conclusion and to opinion, we just don't see a lot of what reality has to offer to us.
Amir, I want to thank you. I think we've gone on for a bit. We haven't even gotten to certain questions that Celan raises, but I want to thank you for putting yourself in this position to actually take this pilgrimage and take some responsibility, which is very hard to do because, as you said, the positions are so stark in a way, and they are signed sometimes without our doing. If you go to Israel, you've taken a position. If you don't go, you've taken a position, etc. So for you to actually take this kind of imperative from Celan to actually slow down and be in that space. So I want to thank you, and thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank the audience for being here. Thank you very much. I think we can have a few questions. I know it's been a relatively long evening already, so there's wine outside, but maybe we have a few questions. Thank you.
All right, and please remember to speak into the mic, and I will start with you here.
Thank you very much. As I was listening, and I heard that Paul Celan arrived in Israel on September 30th, 1969. I checked in my phone. That was during Chol HaMoed Sukkot. So he was there for a few days of Sukkot, which is a very joyous time. So my question is, to what extent is there any information about how he was affected by the Jewish holiday?
Great question, thank you. As far as I know, he was not affected, or I couldn't find any traces of him being a part of the Jewish high holidays. Yeah.
It's probably a very small question, but it's thinking about the title again of that poem. Two things occurred to me is the deer is an intimate. I don't know German, but I know there's some relationship around meaning in a conversation, and also in English it would be it's like just think is like, how is that title and conveyed in a more German sense? I know it's a tricky question to ask, but
would be something maybe because of the imagine. Can you imagine, not in a kind of cynical, but can you imagine, but sort of, can you imagine this could be a reality? So this kind of so can you imagine, or imagine would be, which today sounds like John Lennon, which is kind of wonderful actually, that it resonates with song. But it's sort of more opening up, sort of think it, as if I want to put this thought in your head. It is intimate in a way. Think of this, right?
There's an urgency.
Yeah.
If I understand this correctly, it has an urgency that goes beyond stell dir vor.
Yeah, and it's not formal in a way. Think about this fact. It's more. I think it is closer to the imagination, right? Think dir. Yeah.
Thank you, Uli and Amir, for this very detail-rich presentation and for taking us on this journey with you. I had a question about a word in the poem, actually. I wanted to go back to the poem, a complicated word.
Let's do that, yeah.
Heimat.
Heimat.
A loaded word, also in German. And I was curious to hear a little bit more about Celan's conception of Heimat, particularly as it relates to a question that another German language writer, survivor, also with an anagram name, Jean Amery, posed in the title to an essay. He asked, "Wie viel Heimat braucht der Mensch?" How much Heimat does a person need? So I wondered if you could that's a big question, I suppose. But lead us through maybe a little bit more about how Celan conceived of this notion of Heimat, particularly with his trip to Israel as well.
It's a wonderful question. Thank you, Elise. Heimat, I would maybe venture to say, as someone who's not, German is not my native tongue. I was not raised in German, so I'm opening it up. Heimat was, especially after the war, a slightly tainted, if not slightly tainted word, Heimat, because it was a part of the vocabulary used, among others, by the Nazis. So I think his relationship to that word is conflicted because of that as well. But it's conflicted also because nowhere, I would venture to say, is Celan feeling at home There's no place he would call Heimat. Throughout his work, in various places, he thinks about space and about place, but Heimat as a term, as a notion, as a vision, doesn't exist for him.
And Heimat means sort of national belonging, sort of where you belong or geographic belonging. But I think for him, I read this in one of my readings of Celan, I tried to say, Heine says at some point, the Torah is our homeland. Heine was not religious in a way, who converts, but he is at that moment. For this generation, he was the Jewish poet. So the bar mitzvah present that was de rigueur, that was meant everybody got Heine's collected works. I know this because we were gifted many editions of Heine's works here at NYU by people whose parents came to America and then their kids couldn't read German and said, we have these books, can you just take these books? So Heine says the language is a home. So I think Celan would come closer to that, and I think otherwise it would resonate. It's so suffused with, and then he comes out of a place in the world that he says it's been pushed off the map and out of history. He says, I come from Czernowitz, which is no longer part of history and no longer part of space even, he says, because after the words is kind of spaceless, timeless. So I think he doesn't even think Heimat can anchor you, but language is maybe that. The surprising thing is he had so many languages at his command. He's a very prolific translator, and he could have written in Romanian or in Russian or in French, presumably, and he chooses to write in German. Hebrew, I'm not sure how good is. What did people say when he went to Israel? How good his Hebrew was?
His Hebrew was quite
better than mine.
Yeah, it was quite good. Yeah, I mean, there is a conversation. So while in Jerusalem, the poet Yehuda Amichai interviews him, and there is a short recording out of this interview. And it's clear during the interview that he understands a lot, and every once in a while he can interject, with clear understanding of Hebrew. And he uses Hebrew in some of his most important poems. He uses Hebrew words in his poetry as well, including in the poems he's writing upon returning from Israel to Paris in 1969. So, yeah.
We're going to take another question, but I would like to hear what you refer to, what Jean Amiri actually says, how much Heimat does a person need? In a terrible way, maybe Amirians are enough to survive, because actually Heimat was a way to murder people. It was also a concept used against them, so maybe enough to survive is a lot, right? And this is what we're looking at here, what you're looking at in Jerusalem and in Israel today. You need enough to survive and to actually live a life of dignity and equality, etc. There's a couple more questions. Maybe we'll take three in a row, and then those three right there, Evan and Danya. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. I had a question about your thematizing of resistance and rebellion. I could make the question long-winded, but basically, I wonder what you think about thematizing martyrdom instead, because from my reading, and the story of Masada is like one of martyrdom. And resistance, but I just wonder if it almost feels a little anachronistic to me to say that he was. If I'm thinking with Celan, it feels like I'm not thinking rebellion and resistance. I'm thinking like, how can I keep going? And eventually the answer to that is I can't. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's my and it also feels there is a kind of recuperative reading that you're doing. Where and saying that it's not, you were very careful to say he's not a Zionist, and he just wants a homeland for the Jews, and he's not, he's not, and can you really not be? I mean, can you want a homeland for the Jews in 1969 and not be a nationalist? Is a question I have, I suppose, and it seems like actually, if you were to kind of blind read this poem, there is a lot of the Zionist, the strength to strength, and the soldier and the military. And these things that are like in the habitable earth. This is like this is our earth, this is the land for the this is it, and this is the unbearable and the ineffaceable. It's like might. That is what I get from this, and it's not within reach really for him, personally is the feeling. But like, just think, what if it were, I know that's a very long question, but I guess the question's about martyrdom and hope versus resistance.
Well, thank you for all of it. It was fantastic. I'll try to kind of order my thoughts. What's interesting about the poem is what's not in the poem. For example, the word Israel is not in the poem. Nowhere. A year later, Celan writes a poem he never publishes in which Israel as a noun appears. But he goes back to this notion of thinking. So he's writing about the spirit that continues to think and live. So Israel is the spirit that thinks and lives. We don't have time to get into it, but what I'm trying to say is that yes, one can read this poem as a quasi-Zionist poem, but I think it would come short of what the poem actually does. And that is the 4 times in which he urges us in the imperative to think. So don't take out the flag and celebrate and sing in the streets, etc. No, think.
And I think the other thing is, you're right, it could be read in this way, but the time of this poem, as I said earlier, the tense is the present, but it's the future. So it's a bit ambiguous. I think if it was purely the present, then it would have established, we won the war, we're done, we settled, we claimed this space, or this plot of earth. But then every stanza actually goes into the future. And the last one, and it keeps evoking, let's say, the unburied, Yad Vashem, the name and the hand. So he keeps on invoking the Masada, which is martyrdom and suicide. He keeps invoking an impossible history, one not of victory, not of survival actually, of actually an unburied sort of suffering that's not even martyrdom. So I think the tense of the poem is really complicated, because I think you're right, if it's really just this present, I see this in Jerusalem, this is what it is, we won the war. But he's opening it up into a space, and that's what I think you try to say. He's tentative, and then the terrible thing is that the biography sort of says something else, but that the poem is still with us. So I think the opening it up opens it up to your question, is to affirm a homeland for the Jews the same as a national agenda. Was it possible to think of Jews living in Israel alongside Arab Israelis? That was possible. That's still considered a viable idea by some people, maybe. So in some ways, is it possible to have two people in one place, kind of? The exclusivity is what he comes out of. The Jews couldn't live in Europe. They were exterminated. So in some ways, he's evoking this, but he's saying, is there a possibility here? And I'm saying, we're not saying this is inscribed, but I think the poem doesn't totally settle it. And the time of the poem is very important. The future, there was a victory. He's optimistic. He falls in love. He has this amazing affair, and then he goes back to Paris early because he can't handle it. There's something also there that he actually doesn't find the presence of Israel to be reassuring for him, right?
No redemption.
He doesn't find himself, and he wants to connect. And we said yesterday, these probably also come. They're all his friends from Chernovitz who survived, and they came, and they look at him and they say, what are these poems? They actually want him to be the famous poet and have no idea what he's trying to do. And he feels, again, they don't understand me. Ilana Shmuly understood him, right?
Yeah.
But everybody else?
Especially in the second reading in Tel Aviv, where no poets and no thing, or hardly any, was there. Who comes to the second reading in Tel Aviv are the people from Chernovitz, from the Bukovina, so Holocaust survivors who, just live around in the center of Israel, and the famous poet comes to give a reading.
And the other part is what Amir is involved with also is a totally separate project. What's important is also to have other voices, and to have Palestinian scholars and artists address this. This is actually quite important, I think, to open this up in a way that is not a foregone conclusion. This leads to Jewish Israeli scholars or Zionists sort of claiming this space to say this is opening something up. Yeah. And you're working with people from all backgrounds to reflect on whether he opens up something else or whether he's actually just allowing his work to be collapsed into a Zionist narrative, right? To put it very bluntly. But Evan, you had no? And then we have 2 more questions, okay.
Omar Khayyam's most famous poem, Think, in this dim caravanserai where light alternates night and day and sultan after sultan goes his merry way. Where did he get it? I did some investigation. Think. He got it from the verses of the Quran. If there was a Muslim here, he would know that the beginning verses, sometimes it's listen translated into think, think. So if you accept that as part of the background to this think, there is an on-the-ground world of Israel and that Arab existence that is in the poem.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Amir, for infusing the presentation with your photographs, both the historical and the contemporary ones, and in addressing it with your point of view, which I thought was really important, and bringing us through Jerusalem from your point of view in these spaces. But my question is, it seems so romantic that Salon would write Shmuly with not just letters, but include 2 poems every time. And so I'm wondering, when were these poems, the poems also that he included in the letters, when were they published? I'm assuming after his death. And then during his lifetime, was there, well, I'm assuming she wrote back. And so was she encouraging in the letters in terms of the work?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. She's writing back, and her letters are beautiful, very moving and very thoughtful. And I think there's something about the letters she sends him that encourages him to continue to write poetry. So I could think of at least 2 examples in which words in the poems are an answer in poetry to something she says in the letters. So in a way, they write together. Yeah? I would even go so far to say is that, that their letter writing maybe prolongs his life with a few months, because he goes back and he goes again into a crisis mode. And she tries in the letters, I mean, they're incredibly moving. She tries in the letters to remind him of the time they had in Jerusalem. There's this one image I'd like to share with you. So on the way from Bethlehem back into the city, the sun is going down, and because of the way the city is built, there's a reflection of the sun in their direction. And they call it the gold boye, the golden boy, yeah. So she reminds him of that light time and again in the letters. She tells him, remember that light we saw coming at us, from the city. And again, this is a term, the gold boy, that he then uses in one of the poems.
Maybe this is a nice place to end on. It's sort of, we're not saying, I don't think we're trying to think, oh, and this love in this place which is so fraught is in a way to undo or to deny the political nightmare that Jerusalem has become, and it is for many people, but to say actually what keeps him alive at this moment is this love, really. I think you can say that. And ultimately his poetry is not politics. And in some ways, I think not politics in an irresponsible way of saying I'm not providing a solution. But I'm trying to show that what you call the complexity, that we have to keep on trying to open up a space through and with language, even as language has been corrupted already. And he's working with people, Sholem, these people who are reading him, who are all thinking, how do you actually come up with a language and an idiom that isn't instrumentalized to just provide political solutions, right? So love is one way. It doesn't, I think we should stay with that for the moment. He writes her these letters, and that's it. What happens afterwards is biography. That is not what we're talking about.
That's true, but we're also left with the poetry. Yes. And what poetry can do, and I think, beyond all things we said today, Uli, it's also about, incredible poetry and the power of poetry to invite us to think and to connect, with other human beings, also under very complex political circumstances.
And, we want to thank Juliane for hosting us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir and Uli, for these extraordinarily rich readings and for your expert guidance, time travel guidance, I should say, through the past and what then used to be the future, and always connecting it to the present, which we should never forget. And thank you for your wonderful patience and engaged listening and the really wonderful and smart questions. Come back, join us for other events, and now have a glass of wine and join us for a continuation of the questions. Thank you.